I want to just sort of briefly talk about, and I'm going to use Safari for this, thinking about AJAX requests in Rotten Potatoes. So in Rotten Potatoes, we've implemented reviews. We have a list of movies, and we know that we can click on a movie to show the reviews. That all works. What if we wanted to maybe just preview those reviews or see something a little more easily? So I've got a button here that when we click on it, what does this button do? Well, it opens up a modal that dynamically makes an AJAX request in the background that loads the reviews. And in this case, what is it loading? Well, it's loading a table of reviews. And the really nice thing is, if I go back and open the inspector, we can start to do things like see on the side over here that there's a request for reviews. We can inspect that AJAX request. And in this case, what we have is a fairly simple setup. We have a button which has a handler registered that all that's being called is the regular path in Rails for the movie reviews index. And what that returns is just an HTML table that the browser then renders. So the code here, we're not going to go through all of it in detail, but the controller action is perhaps the simplest piece of this. So I have my reviews controller in this case, an index method. If the request is an AJAX request, render the tables partial, and that tables partial requires some data to be passed to it. That variable is named reviews. So I say reviews is just at reviews like I would normally load. And if I visit this page in a web browser, what I get the normal reviews index page. In our application, this does rely on a file that we've called movie.js. And we can see at the bottom here, we're not going to scroll through absolutely everything, right? But we call our setup handler. We've made a movie pop-up object. But in here, we essentially we're leveraging the Bootstrap API and documentation. So Bootstrap totals that when we want to open a modal, we actually work with a callback or an event called show.bs.modal, which is Bootstrap's way of saying, here's an event that I've made that when the modal opens, you can perform some action. So Bootstrap is going to handle that part for us. We get the URL that we want to load. And then in our JavaScript client, we make a GET request to the particular URL, which in this case will be movie's review path. And what happens? Well, when it's successful, we call a different function, show reviews. And what does show reviews do? Well, it's actually pretty simple. It finds our modal. It takes whatever HTML content it got back and just stuffs it in the middle of the modal. It actually isn't trying to be super clever. But the nice thing is by leveraging built-in browser technologies, you get a lot of that for free. Perhaps, sort of most tricky part of this is when we are working with the actual button on our web page that shows the modal. So if I click on something else, what's going on here? Well, this button, we've used Bootstrap's documentation such that it tells us that, what are we toggling? We're toggling something called a modal. Our target, this is the ID of a div that we've placed on our website. And what URL do we know to go to? Well, we have an attribute that we've named data movie reviews path. And where do we get that path? Our standard Rails route helpers. And because this button uses a speech bubble as its icon, we should probably provide an ARIA label that says show reviews. And generally, you want to keep these things sort of short and sweet. And we could reiterate the movie title, but we don't really need to because we know that this button is linked to a table whose row includes some kind of description that this thing is linked to this particular movie. So, with providing an ARIA label, all we're really just saying is, hey, this little icon here means show reviews. And that's really the AJAX flow. Set up a button that will trigger some action, write some JavaScript code that does whatever that action should be, or leverage a library like Bootstrap to handle things like modals. In particular, I'm leveraging Bootstrap's modal because getting the accessibility right for what happens when you actually open and close a modal, there's quite a lot there, and Bootstrap does it for us. And then finally, make that AJAX request and have a controller that knows how to respond to our AJAX request. But I already had all this written, so really I needed to add just a couple of lines of code to this particular controller. So that's a whirlwind tour of AJAX in the browser.